Why are train tickets so expensive in the UK? We're going to look at the top 10 things that answer that question, and one of them will absolutely shock you. Number 1. What are the main sources of income for the railway? Today, there are two principal sources of income for the railway. Fares income from the tickets we all buy to travel, and a subsidy from the government. There is a bit of income from other sources, such as property, and the government is trying to increase the value of that, but it remains a relatively low percentage of the total and will do for some time to come. Number 2. How much subsidy do the railways need then? The gap between the total money that comes from the tickets we all buy and the total cost of the railway has changed over the years. Pre-pandemic, the total amount of government support for the operational railway was £5.4 billion. The pandemic changed everything. The initial impact was dramatic. The government told people not to travel but kept trains running for key workers. The amount of subsidy required shot up to a peak of £20.5 billion in 2020, before reducing to £12.5 billion by 2023. Post the pandemic, the total number of journeys made on the railway has largely recovered to the levels seen pre-pandemic. The problem is that business and commuter travel has not recovered, thanks to an increase in working from home and virtual meetings. That reduction has largely been offset by a rise in leisure travel, but the average fare per leisure traveller is lower than business and commuting, with the result that the railway's income from tickets has not recovered to the levels seen pre-pandemic. The government has to either fund the difference or cut services. Number 3. Who controls fares? Around 45% of fares are regulated. That means that rail companies can't just charge what they want. Any annual increases are restricted and usually linked to changes in the retail prices index, plus or minus a certain number of percentage points. Since 1993 and the passing of the Railways Act at the time of privatisation, it is the government who makes the decision on how much regulated fares may rise by. Many people think it has been private companies making this decision, but it has not. Since 2020 and the pandemic, all fares have been controlled by the government, not just the regulated ones. So the level of rail fares has always largely been a political decision, and now it is a totally political decision. Number 4. So why does the government not reduce fares to get more people to travel by train and generate more income? If it were that simple, then they would do so, as it would achieve the Treasury's objective of reducing the amount of public subsidy required to operate the railways. But it's not that simple. For a start, different types of traveller tend to want to travel at completely different times. Some people must travel at specific times to get to work or meetings, others are far more flexible. The relationship between price and demand, something economists call price elasticity of demand, varies too. In the past, commuter fares tended to be what we call inelastic. As prices rose, demand didn't really fall much because most people had to travel. That's largely why fares regulation was introduced at privatisation, to stop private companies simply charging as much as they liked. Some fares are much more elastic. A small increase in price can lead to a large reduction in demand. Competition from car, coach, and even air plays a role here. Number 5. But the Scottish Government has just announced they are scrapping all peak fares, so it must work. The Scottish Government did run a pilot that abolished peak rail fares between October 2023 and September 2024, with the aim of improving awareness of rail travel, making it more viable for people to travel more often and reducing car travel. The Scottish Government believes the pilot was successful in improving awareness of rail, with over 80% of survey respondents stating that they were making more trips by rail. And the pilot did significantly reduce the cost of travel by rail at peak times. The average saving across all ticket types was around 17%. The problem is that whilst there is strong evidence that the pilot helped existing users who were already in work, it had a lower impact in encouraging full-time workers who did not use rail to start to use it. It also had a minimal impact on overall car travel and has tended to benefit those on higher incomes within the central belt. The Scottish Government even admitted that the pilot had a limited impact in terms of meeting the First Minister's priorities for Scotland. However, notwithstanding this, they decided to scrap peak fares permanently from September 2025. Since this will increase the amount of money the railways require from the government in the form of subsidy, one can only assume that reductions in public expenditure on other services are going to be required to pay for this and still balance the books. Number 6. How do rail fares in the UK compare to other European countries? It is extremely difficult to compare different European countries with each other, largely because the way countries fund their railways and then categorise that expenditure is so different. For example, there are at least 3 different ways that European countries fund the cost of railway infrastructure, and that's just at a summary level. The detail is even more complex. In some countries, such as the UK, the vast majority of passenger train services are counted as something called a public service obligation, whereas in others, such as France, they are not all categorised as such, with the very popular TGV high-speed train services being categorised as outside the PSO. Confusing? Well, all of this makes creating an apples for apples comparison almost impossible. The general consensus amongst railway professionals and wider policy experts is that the UK is one of the countries in Europe which tends to take the view that a greater proportion of the cost of the railway should fall to the people who use it, passengers, rather than taxpayers generally. Number 7. What changed and who changed it? Surely train tickets used to be cheaper. Nope, they didn't. Eminent transport economist John Ciro noted recently that in 1965 there were 11 daily trains from London to Edinburgh, 5 of which were overnight sleepers. The fastest journey time was 6 hours and the standard single fare was 95 shillings or £4.75. However, the average weekly wage at the time was £13.12, £13.60. Therefore, a single fare accounted for 35% of the average wage. Fast forward to 2025, there are 39 daily trains, of which just 1 is an overnight sleeper. Even the slowest services via Birmingham take under 6 hours, and the fastest take a shade over 4 hours. The standard single fare is now £204.80, while John observes that the average weekly wage is £677, excluding bonuses. So that single fare now accounts for 30% of the average wage, actually less than in 1965. Plus, you can also now get to Edinburgh for far less. Lumo, the open access operator, has tickets on sale for £78.90, just 11.7% of the average weekly wage. Truth is that rail fares have always been expensive, but full, standard open fares relative to the average weekly wage are no more expensive now than 60 years ago. And it's actually possible to travel far more cheaply than in the past if you are prepared to be flexible when you travel, and it's even better still if you have a rail card. As John says, the past is generally far worse than we don't remember. Number 8. Is there anything that can be done to make fares cheaper? Yes, there are 3 main options. First, the government could change its policy, reduce fares, and then increase the amount of subsidy to fund the resulting deficit. That's highly unlikely to ever happen, though. Transport is not considered a major priority when compared to education, health, defence, and social security, and so the pressure is likely to remain on reducing the amount of subsidy required, not increasing it. Second, the industry could reduce costs. This subject is a whole video on its own, but there is no doubt that the cost base of the railway is far too high. Whilst part of the reason is thanks to inflation on the costs of things like fuel and materials and increases in employers' national insurance costs, there are around 100,000 people employed on the railway. The industry itself needs to challenge the way that many tasks and processes are carried out to bring the overall costs down. Third, more passengers could travel by train, increasing the total money that comes from fares. However, in many places, the rail network is bursting at the seams. There are over 1.7 billion passengers travelling each year, and so more services will be required, which means more capital investment in the network to support them. That, in turn, will require more government support. Number 9. Will nationalisation help? By itself, no. There is no evidence to suggest that simply bringing the ownership of a rail business back into the public sector reduces costs or increases the amount of income from fares. Indeed, there is evidence that having private train operators involved post-1993 created incentives that led to a drive to reduce costs and drive up income, even if some of the growth in rail travel since 1993 is also down to an improvement in general economic activity. What is vital is that after years of highly centralised control by government, the leaders within the rail industry must now be empowered to run the railway companies properly and not be micromanaged by civil servants. Otherwise, nationalisation will likely lead to an increase in cost, but very little else. Number 10. What's the outlook for fares then? There is a general consensus that the fare system on the railway is overly complex and confusing, and that does put people off. It does need to be reformed and fast. But people confuse the system being reformed with prices coming down, and they are not the same thing at all. For all the reasons explained in this video, a combination of government policy, the costs of the railway and other factors besides means train fares are unlikely to be coming down anytime soon.